So I guess what I wanted to do tonight is kind of what I did earlier today on Facebook, which was just to have a bit of a discussion, a bit of a Q&A on metaphysical, spiritual, paranormal, whatever you want to call it, kind of topics. So if there's anything that you want to look at or any questions you want to ask concerning those kinds of things, I'd definitely be happy to share my perspective with you. When you talk to the dead, how does it feel? So it's different. Every soul is different. So every spirit contact is going to be a little bit different. Um, Usually so I'm primarily clairvoyant clairsentient. So I see and feel predominantly. When I make the link to spirit, there is a shift that takes place. The only way I know how to describe it is it's kind of I know when I'm getting ready to work because there's this part of me that begins to feel slightly um, disassociated, slightly I don't know, floaty is not the right word, but just a little bit outside myself. And if I guess the other way too is like I know when the presence of spirit is there because there is a tangible shift to the atmosphere. It's a almost like a pressure change, and from that point, it's sort of like an inflow of feeling and picture and things like that. It can look very different. Sometimes it's very physical in that they will impress me with physical things that they went through to either identify how they passed or things like that. But a big part of it is emotion. The feeling of the personality of the individual is a big thing that comes through, and I think that that's something that's incredibly important to be able to express is the personality of the communicator. And when there's that really nice blending that takes place, when I have a good alignment, when I have a good rapport with the spirit communicator, there really is sort of this loss of a sense of self. So it's not as if I'm not there. It's not as if I don't know what's going on, but they feel like my memories. They feel like my emotions. They feel like my feelings. They feel like my thoughts and my opinions. So sometimes it's hard not to slip into a little bit of like a first person perspective with it. So I don't know if that answers that question or not, but that's very much how that process feels for me. Hey Fabio, hey Craig. Um, so yeah, that's a bit of my experience in the one-to-one sitting context. Hey there. As a person who's never gone to a medium before, are there things a patron should do before going to the session? I do think there are a few things. So the first thing is check your expectations, because sometimes I think because we have all these shows like Hollywood Medium and things like that, that we have this specific idea of what we think our contact is going to look like, and the medium, the instrument, they get what they get. And things that you might think are important to touch on aren't important to the communicator, but things that are important to the communicator might not be things that would immediately stand out or jump out to you. So I think the best thing is don't have expectations and just go with an open mind. The other thing too is the calmer you are, the easier it's going to be for the medium to access the energy. And it's not that they're working psychically and that they're accessing the information from you, but you're a part of sort of the soup of ingredients that go on in a one-to-one sitting. So there's the medium, there's the spirit communicator, and there's you. It's this three-way connection. And so the calmer that you are, the easier it's going to be for sort of the medium to get past you to that level or to that vibration of spirit. The other thing too that I will say that I think is important, in a good session, I think that there will always be things that cannot be verified in the moment. There should be a lot of things that should be able to be verified and validated in the moment. But I think if I went to a medium and every single thing that they said was absolutely 100 correct, and there was nothing in there that I could say like, not sure about, I'd actually be a little bit suspect, and you'd think it would be the other way around. But the fact of the matter is, spirit will tell you things that you don't know, so you may and I get it all the time. And my thing is, I trust my link in spirit more than I trust the sitter that I actually have. So if spirit shows me something, I know what I saw, I know what I heard, I know what I felt. And so that's what I go with. And I'll say, humor me and then just take it with you. I could absolutely be wrong because I'm a human being and I can be flawed. But I'm feeling this. So trust this, take it with you, ask about it, and they'll message or email back, you said this and it didn't make sense, but then this happened. Or then I found out from my mom that this person did, used to collect rabbits, or, whatever it was. Because we only know an aspect of our loved one. We go seeking a loved one, but we have to remember that the way that they were with us might not have been the way that they were behind closed doors. So one, I think that's okay when there are things that aren't immediately verifiable. But I also think, two, because people have like brain glitches, brain farts, psychic amnesia, whatever you want to call it, that I used to recommend people write things down. But if they're busy writing things down, then how well are they really listening? So in this day and age, I say pull up the memo apps on your phone and just record the session and go back and listen to it later, because you're going to get things that you didn't get before, and you're going to be so emotionally overwhelmed if you have a good connection that you'll be foggy. You'll walk out and be like, I do remember exactly what happened, but I couldn't tell you. I've been having dreams where the deceased are in the dream. Have you or are you experienced in similar phenomena? What's interesting is most people are more psychic in their sleep because their like left brain conscious mind is out of the way than they are awake. I'm the opposite. I can do my psychic work all day long when I'm awake, but I rarely have like spiritual dreams. Not that I don't remember my dreams, because frequently I do, but it's always like, rolling down the hill in a jelly donut, nothing of like a real weighty spiritual nature. Not that I never have, but I think one of the big distinction is you can always tell sort of the difference between a dream and a visitation, or a dream and a vision, or a dream and a message, because there's a weightiness, I think, that comes to dreams that have some sort of spiritual significance. If it's just sort of the subconscious vomit from your mind processing itself when you sleep, it's like you woke up and then you're like, oh, that's weird, and then you forget about it. Those dreams that tend to stick with you usually have something to further investigate within that. And usually too, when there's loved ones that come forward in the dreams themselves are incredibly lucid. And so that's another telltale factor. This is a great question. Do you work with the gatekeeper? How did you meet them? So I guess I do have a guide who I would consider a gatekeeper. In old spiritualism, especially in America, you have what they call the inner band and the outer band. And the outer band are more of those guides who tend to be temporary, to come and go. We could call them spirit teachers. They come in for a particular time to imbue a particular quality, teach us a particular purpose. And then the inner band guides are the ones that are in this particular philosophy, which I don't necessarily agree with us from birth till death. So the inner band consists of a joy guide, a chemist, a doctor teacher, a protector, which they used to call the Indian guide, which is super offensive now, and we know that, and then your master guide, which are sort of like more highly evolved souls. You can kind of think of them as like the guides to your guides. And then of that inner band, one of those takes on the role of the gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper is just a fancy way of saying this is the guide who assists in my communication with mediumship. So in that capacity, yes, I do work with the guide that you could call my gatekeeper. He's the guide that I'm the most familiar with. He's really the only guide that I know on a name basis. And I think when people feel like they have to figure out who a bunch of these spirit guides are, that's not the case. It's like juggling 25 different conversations, and then they end up inventing these imaginary guides. For me, I've had one predominant guide over the last 8 or so years who works with me in pretty much all avenues of my work. And when I do spirit communication, I link with his energy first. He brings forward the communicators, and if I am stuck or if there's if that spirit, maybe, like, for example, if someone hasn't been on the other side for very long, they might not understand the mechanics of how to communicate something, so he assists in that way, or I'll ask him for clarification, to kind of ask as an interpreter a little bit. But that's kind of how that process works. The word gatekeeper, the term gatekeeper, never used to bother me, but I don't use it so much anymore, simply because I think people have this idea of, like, they keep bad spirits out and bring the good spirits in. I don't believe in bad spirits. So I don't think that he's protecting me from anything, but energetically assisting in the process. Have you ever seen angel lights, like sparks or lightning bugs, light up and disappearing? I do, and it wasn't until many years later where I was able to sit in seance for physical phenomena, where I then witnessed and knew that some of the experiences that I had when I was younger were spirit lights. When I was a little kid, and I would lay in bed at night and the room was dark, up towards the ceiling, it would almost look like how I would describe, like, when you go to an amusement park and they have bumper cars, and the bumper cars have that like antenna thing that goes up, and then as it moves across the ceiling, there's like little sparks that come off it. That was one of the ways in which I would see when I was younger. So yeah, but I just, those to me are what I would call, like, spirit lights. Travis, can you discuss how you started doing gallery readings and what goes into that? So I still to this day don't do a lot of platform work, usually about 2 or 3 times a year, because people want it. It's not my favorite thing to do. I feel like more of my confidence is in the one-on-one, but I've also never really had a bad platform session, so, and there's different factors for that. So the first time I did platform, I was really not that developed as a medium. So I was 19, 20, and I was working out of a metaphysical center, and it was just different mediums, and there was an audience, and you could give something if you got something. That took a lot of pressure off, because there are others there. And then the second time, my teacher at the time, who I'd mentioned on your Instagram before, we talked about her, Gail St. John, came, and they said they want us to do this gallery. I'm terrified. I've never done galleries. And she's like, if you can do a one-to-one, you can do platform. And I don't really, there wasn't anything that I did to prepare for it. I hadn't had proper training in platform at that point. But I just got up, and you surrender and you do what you do. Looking back, I would probably say it wasn't that well, then versus now that I have training and structure and a good sort of foundation built. But I think that we talk about this too. Some places, some spiritualist camps develop you on the platform at the same time they're developing you for one-to-ones as you're working on your mediumship. And in the United States, what you tend to see more of is, first you develop to a point. We're never fully developed, but first you develop to a point, and then you learn sort of mastery with one-on-ones, and then you sort of graduate to platform. I think that a person, before they attempt platform, should have a solid handle on working in a one-to-one way. They should have a good foundation. They should understand the mechanics of what's different in a one-to-one versus the mechanics of working in a platform setting. They should have cultivated a degree of power to where they are not dependent upon the power that the audience provides, because if you are dependent on that, eventually you'll end up in a circumstance where you will fail. Or not have the best connection, or not be able to sustain the power to hold the connection. I think once that's in place, then there's really 2 different styles of working that are taught. So in the UK, they call it going direct and indirect. The way that I was taught, my teacher called it spirit-centered versus client-centered. They're different ways of saying the same thing, and one is not better than the other. but if there's pros and cons to both, and I think there's a little bit of an in-between is probably the best ground of working. So when I say going direct, that's when you say, I'm coming to the lady in the blue shirt in the second row, may I speak to you? That's not how I work. And then there's indirect or spirit-centered, where you get the information and you share it, and then the people in the audience identify it. I think there needs to be a little bit of both developed. I mean, that's the natural style that developed for me. It was more indirect, but I think that before someone should attempt platform, they should at least have developed the power enough to where there's a sense of direction. So I might say, I've got this man, he looks like this, I feel like he did this is personality, whatever, but I also feel like I'm in the back side of the room, and I feel like I'm more in this second row over here. So, because the thing too is, if you go direct, one, that looks really impressive, but two, you run the risk of defaulting down to the psychic level of vibration. And then the other thing is, how are you deciding where you're going? How is that developed for you? Do you see a light above that person? Do you just feel drawn to that person? And if so, did spirit decide for you to go there, or did you decide for you to go there for whatever it was that attracted you to that person? And it always works best if spirit decides the order in which things go or who you go to, because they've been orchestrating this for a really long time. Now, with client-centered, it may not seem immediately as maybe impressive as to just walk up to this person or, address the person from the platform. But what it does is, because you're throwing information out, it forces you to get really specific information to narrow it down. Because if I just said I had a granny here who loved to bake, 25 people could raise their hands. But if I said I have a granny here who loves to bake, she gives me the name of Alice, I'm also seeing a blue Cadillac, and there was something about an ongoing joke about lipstick on the teeth, that's going to narrow it down, and that is also some pretty decent evidence as well. So if you are going to work in the indirect way, you have to be very specific with what you're throwing out there, and if you're going to work in the direct way, you have to have a really refined sense of direction developed, and you also have to understand the mechanics of why your direction is giving you the direction it is, and making sure that it's coming from spirit and not from you at a psychic level. What are spirit lights an indication of? It's really just the presence of spirit and different ways in which they can manifest using phosphorus from the environment around us. Going back to gallery style, or in spiritualism what we call platform work, I did take a week-long intensive with one of my teachers, one of my Lilydale teachers, that was incredibly helpful as far as platform and how you conduct yourself on the platform and the do's and the don'ts. Because I've done bad things before, not bad things, but things that were frowned upon in the church, like things that I didn't even think about, like you're not supposed to get off, you're not supposed to step down off the platform. And I used to think, why? I like to walk into the audience. It's personal. People like that. There are reasons. They're not just saying that because they're stuffy. There are logistical reasons. People can't see you if you're in the audience, or if they have to turn around and watch you give a 5-minute contact, they're going to lose interest. They don't want to, stretch their backs. All of these different things. And if someone loses interest, or if they can't see you, or they're shutting down because they're like, oh, the message isn't for me, I can't see him back there anyways, power drops, can't use it. Books on spiritualism itself, there's a lot of books on mediumship. There's not a lot of modern books or contemporary books on spiritualism, and the ones that are around aren't that great. A basic one is Talking to the Other Side by Todd Leonard. He's actually, he lives in Japan. He has a home in Japan. He has a home in Camp Chesterfield. He's the historian. He's a PhD. He's an ordained minister. But it's a little bit more from an academic perspective, an academic look at the spiritualist movement. So that's a great resource. But if you can get a hold of books by old spiritualists, and you usually have to go online or to antique bookstores to find them, anything that you can pick up by, well, let's be a little bit more modern first. So anything that you can get by Estelle Roberts, like 50 Years a Medium, anything you can get by Eileen Garrett, her Voices series, those are wonderful. Anything, Hudson Tuttle, Mediumship and Its Laws, any of Maurice Barbanel's Teachings of Silver Birch books are good for the philosophy of spiritualism. So those are ones that I would definitely recommend. But if you go way, way back, and these aren't the easiest books to read because the language is so outdated because they're from the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s. Anything by Cora Richmond, who is sometimes called Cora Hatch or Cora L.V. Hatch or Cora Tappan, depending on who she was married to at the time, are wonderful resources. If you can get a hold of anything from Emma Harding Britton, Leah Fox, one of the original Fox sisters, Leah Fox, the oldest sister, wrote a book. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote on spiritualism and the history of spiritualism. So I know reproductions of those books are still available, but the one that I think is also great too, it's called Mediums and Their Development, I believe it's called. It's by Hugh Gordon Burroughs, and he also has another book called Becoming a Spiritualist, which is more about the philosophy of spiritualism. But those are some of the books that I would recommend on spiritualism. How long after psychic abilities unfold did your mediumship emerge? So I started working, like seeing clients, around the age of 16. Although when I was 7, I had experiences with spirits. I never had communication with spirits, but around 17, I had an experience of passing on a contact that actually took place at school. It was an uncomfortable situation, and I ignored it because I didn't like it, and I didn't want anything to do with it. And then maybe about 2009, so 16, 17, wait, 2000, I was about 19, so about three and a half so years after I started working psychically. I did a little bit of formal training with my mediumship. That was around the time that I did my first platform, things like that. I knew I could do it, but I still didn't have a lot of confidence in it, and it wasn't something that I still was super comfortable with. And then all of that changed in 2012. I moved back to Ohio from New Mexico, and someone wanted a sitting. I was at a real crossroads in my life, and it was a really powerful session, really strong mediumistic session, and ever since then, my work has been about 50-50. But I think that's different for everybody. Some people may never develop mediumistically. Some people will develop super quickly. Some people will develop very slowly, because it's really not up to us. We can only provide the right conditions. Spirit develops it. And that to me is why I would use the word unfoldment more for mediumship and development more for the level of the psychic, because development is formulaic. You do A and B, you get C. I can make a psychic out of almost anybody. I can put people in the right conditions and experiences to draw out mediumistic ability if it's there, but I cannot cultivate it for them. That is the job of spirit. What do you consider essential daily spiritual practice for yourself? Big thing is for me meditation, sitting in the power. It's, for 15 years, it's just habit at this point. It's just as important to me as combing my hair or brushing my teeth. And for anybody, I think meditation is super important, even if it's just 5 minutes a day, even if it's just 10 minutes a day, something to acknowledge your own spirit, something to acknowledge your own divinity. Prayer is also really big for me, which is ironic because I'm not super religious at all, despite growing up Pentecostal in a very sort of charismatic church. And I have very different viewpoints and perspectives on what prayer is and how prayer works. But prayer, to me, is also really important in cultivating the spirit. Can you speak a little bit about the book, The Hierophant of 100th Street? I'm thinking about getting it. The Hierophant of 100th Street was written by a man named Colin Dorn, and it's written in a fictionalized context. But if you know a bit about him and his story, you know that it's really just his story, put in a fictionalized way. and I'm sure there's some liberties for the sake of spiritual teachings. One of the mediums who is mentioned in the book, The Hierophant of 100th Street, is one of my favorite American mediums. It was Clifford Bias. He was a Chesterfield medium. Remarkable, remarkable man, remarkable physical medium. And it really is about the journey of a young boy who grows up in New York and faces some really difficult circumstances, and really grows spiritually as a result of it. And it's very hard to describe. It's something that I think you just have to read. But there's a lot of metaphysical teaching woven throughout it. He kind of reminds me, the story kind of reminds me, if you've ever read anything from Paulo Coelho, how his teachings are sort of woven into the story. It's very much like that, but loosely based off of his own life experience. To communicate every time you sit in the power, or is it more of a safe self-contained practice for you? No, actually, with sitting in the power, it's not about communication. It's not about establishing link. Sitting in the power is about simply being present with spirit, simply being present with the divine mind, blending with it. Not about extending your awareness to get a contact or a communication. It's not about getting a message. It's not about seeing pictures. It's feeling the power. It's letting it move through you. It's letting it cultivate you. It's letting it develop you. So yeah, I would definitely say it's more of a self-contained practice. And when done on a regular basis, can assist when you are in the space or the time or the place to do a contact, to give a contact in an evidential way. Essentially, when you sit for the power, you're fueling the gas tank. And it's all kind of based in the solar plexus. Chakras aren't a big thing in mediumship. But the solar plexus is. The solar plexus truly is. A lot of people think spiritual. They think these upper energy centers. Solar plexus is the seat of the soul. Solar plexus is where that spark of the divine resides. Solar plexus is the gas tank. And when we sit and blend with spirit, that energy, our reserves, build up there for us to draw on and use. And by sitting in the power, we continually replenish those reserves. Of the idea of transference in a spiritual context, can you not exactly sure what you mean by that. Can you give me an example? What does blending feel like to you personally? Okay, so just to give you an example, when I sit for spirit, I sit and I feel my own energy, and it's just to essentially establish a baseline. So I know how my energy feels today. Is it really open? Is it really closed? Is it tight? Does it feel loose? Does it feel flowing? Does it feel staticky? So I now know what I feel like. And then I can expand outward, can push that divine spark within me outward to expand my aura, out to blend with my surroundings, to fill the room and beyond, link with the earth, the air, the animals, the trees, the wood, the coffee table, whatever it is, just really sort of blending, and then lifting my awareness to spirit, lifting my awareness to the God of my understanding, feeling that power and letting my power of the individual, of the personal, my individual spark, blend with that, whether you want to call it the higher self, God, the Holy Spirit, whatever, blend with that higher divine essence. And then I sit in that for a bit. And it's sort of expansive. Sometimes it's this sense of an awareness of many things, and sometimes it sort of vacillates between all and nothing, nothingness and everything. It's like that oneness. In oneness, kind of go into that nothingness. And I just sit, and it just feels like you can breathe and you're being nourished. But so to further discuss what you speak of when you ask of blending. So I then like to invite my guide, my helper, all of them, any of them really, but as I said, there's primarily one guide who I have the closest awareness of, into my space. And so I always know, and it's the same thing when I do a session, I always know when he begins to come into my space, because I experience what's called the calling card. So the calling card is like their energetic signature. So for my particular guide, when I send out the thought of draw close, come near, blend with me, let us share mind, let us share heart, let us share space, there's a pressure and a numbness that takes place over here. And every time I ask for him to come into my space, that's how it feels. Now, the longer that I sit in that space with the intention of blending and sharing space, there's a tightness that goes around my head, and there's this almost like a numb feeling that goes down my jaw, and my face feels like it starts to get really, really tight. Almost like those face masks that you use where you put them on and they dry and they get really tight, then you peel them off. That's what it feels like. So I don't really know if that is a fuller expansion of the original calling card that I'm so familiar with, or if it's actually the influence of some of the other guides and helpers that are coming in and making adjustments to my body and things like that as I sit in the power. But that's sort of the tactile aspect of the blending. I'll say, like, in regards to giving a contact in a private sitting, when I've blended with, I know that I'm starting to get the link. I know that I'm going in the energy. I know that I'm beginning to blend because I begin to speak faster. There's a quickening that happens. But sometimes too, like I said, it's almost like you feel like these aren't my thoughts. I feel like it's, I have to stop and reword things because I worded it in the first person because it feels like they're my own thoughts and feelings and memories, or the physical sensations. You might feel taller or broader or shorter or smaller or frail, or people might comment, well, you're making that mannerism. That's the mannerism my husband used to make. So I think there's different layers to the blending, physically, mentally, emotionally. Oh, healing of hands. Some say mediums can absorb the energy in the sitting seance while working. These are examples of transference. So I'm going to break this into a couple different parts because there's a few different things I have to say about this. When it comes to healing in a mediumistic capacity, there's different ways that we go about this. So sometimes in a spiritualist church, you'll see spiritual healing in the spiritualist context, and that is in sort of that generic way. It's sort of linking with that divine essence and passing that through, not unlike Reiki. But when you're talking spirit healing, the difference is, in the same way that someone can use mediumship to pass a message, that the medium who engages in healing work, we have chemists, we have those in spirit guides who are there to look out for the physiological elements and changes, and when we do the mediumistic work. So we can call them a chemist, we can call them a spirit doctor, a spirit physician, whatever you want to call it. What happens is the healer blends with the appropriate spirit healer when they're performing a healing. And they're blending with the aura of the sitter, and then they're linking with their guide. And then when they feel that they've blended with their spirit physician, through entrainment, the healing takes place. They're simply holding space for that. Now, if within a hands-on healing context, if anybody is ever taking on the energy of the client, the energy of the recipient of the healing, then they're not doing spiritual healing, that's magnetic healing. You're using your own energy, and that's probably not the best way to go about it, because you really don't want to be taking all that stuff into yourself, especially when it's not necessary. Can magnetic healing help the recipient? Absolutely, to the detriment of the facilitator of the healing. So that on that. But the other thing too is to talk about sort of transference or absorption of energy within the context of a seance. So when you're in seance conditions, and usually in the context of spiritualism, we're talking darkroom seances for physical phenomena, the physical medium, has to have developed and cultivated a huge degree of physical power for these proceedings to take place. And everybody who's part of it, almost like even like with a group reading, they all contribute to the overall power of the seance. And depending on how phenomena is being produced, whether it's through new energy or through ectoplasm, small degrees of that are being drawn from the sitters. Not as much as from the medium, but small degrees of it are coming from the sitters. That gets returned to them when the sitting is done. However, there is a bit of an energetic transference in the sense that because you are spending that time in that room where there is such condensed power, there's benefit to that you will absorb. So when that energy that was taken from you is returned at the end of the seance, there's always more to it that you're getting back than you ever gave out. So people can walk out of a seance and they're like, wow, I was feeling really tired, but now I'm really buzzed. Or wow, I haven't felt good all week, but I feel good. Or I left the seance and wow, my back hasn't hurt for the first time in weeks. So that kind of thing is absolutely possible. About everything. Anyways, thank you guys for popping on here and hopping on here, and I enjoyed some of your questions. I love conversing, and I enjoyed it. So thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you guys soon.